Hello, and welcome to another episode of Rewiring Health. My name is Kelly, and I'm your host of this podcast. And today I'm going to be talking about why it's so important that we're aware of the stories that we keep and how we can shift our mindset from one that is stagnant to one that is progressive and healing. And by the end of this episode, you'll have a better understanding of the importance of experimentation and fun in healing. And I'll explain that as we kind of go on. And also how you can be your own catalyst for change. And by just being aware of the things that you're telling yourself, the stories you're living by, and what you have going through your head day in and day out, how that can really influence how you move forward and in what ways you heal. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is why we have to really be aware of the stories that we keep and also the stories that we make our own. And what I mean by that is that we're bombarded by a lot of things throughout the day. And if you're one to watch the news, there's a lot of negativity with that. There's a lot of negativity sometimes when you talk to people. And all those things can add up if you don't know how to filter it properly for yourself. And I'm going to give you a story that I have that it just happened to me recently, and why it's so important that we really know how to handle what's ours versus what someone else's. And one thing that I can really discuss is that currently I am about 6 months pregnant, and that is obviously a lot of change going on with myself, my body. There's just a lot to handle when you're pregnant. And there was an article on the news, and I am not one to watch the news. I used to watch the news all the time, and I recognized how I was really absorbing a lot of the negativity that was on it. So I really just have cut myself off of it. But just to be aware of what was going on, I happened to throw the news on. And there was this story about how, you go through all these hormonal changes. It was talking about pregnancy, and it was one woman's story of how she was pregnant, went through this awful depression while she was pregnant. And then, of course, she had postpartum depression after that as well. And it went into a lot of the details of what her experience was and the struggles that she went through. And if you're someone who takes that story, it really could be very fearful if you really kind of took it to heart. So for me, that's always a concern. I think with anyone who's pregnant, you don't know how your system is going to react. You don't know how your head is going to, change, or your brain space, or your mind, your thoughts. And to hear these stories of, women who are pregnant going through these really, really difficult times, if you take it on as your own, you can live your whole pregnancy in fear that that's your story, or you can live in fear that after you have the baby, that's your story and that's what's going to happen. And it's so important that you're able to separate what's yours versus what someone else's. And it's a reminder all the time that that is not yours. You can't own that. And everything you hear, you can't own everything you hear. That's not your story. And for me, that was a reminder I had to kind of remind myself that that's not my story. Of course, I can feel for that woman who's going through that, and I can understand how much of a struggle that is, but I can't own her story. That is not my story. And it is so important, no matter what you're going through, that when you hear things going on, whether it's something that's really, really negative or just fearful, that you can recognize what's yours versus what is theirs. And it may seem really simple. Of course, that's not my story, but our brains have a way of having a hard time differentiating between what's ours and what someone else's. So when we hear something that has happened to somebody, you your brain tends to kind of own that because our brains have this ability, and unfortunately it is an adaptability that we've gained, but it's become more maladaptive now. In a way to protect ourselves, we tend to think more negatively. So negative stories stay and linger more than positive ones. So that's why you could have 1,000 good things happen to you and one bad thing, and it happens to be that one bad thing that sticks out in your head and kind of replays. And unfortunately, because of the way we're wired, that's kind of how our brains have kept us safe and have allowed us to evolve. Unfortunately, in today's world, though, that has become more maladaptive. But our brains are not adjusting, very quickly, of course, to that. And it takes years for our brains to realize that that's not real. So when you hear something that is negative, even though it's not your story, your brain has a tendency to kind of own that because it takes that information and says, wow, that happened to somebody else. If I can live almost vicariously through that person, I can protect myself from that happening. So that's where we have to really be able to differentiate and use our prefrontal cortex to differentiate what's ours versus what is theirs. And I say this because there's a lot of things that we can do that with. We can do that with someone who's going through an eating disorder, and we may hear someone who has relapsed, unfortunately, or has gone through a struggle or with that, or just has had really poor physical effects from it. And we can take that and a lot of times make that fearful again, will we go through that? This person had a really hard time, took them 10 years to overcome their eating disorder. Will it take me 10 years to overcome my eating disorder? So again, we have to know what is ours and what is theirs. And even though many people go through many, many struggles, your story is very different from their story. And you have to know what is your story versus what is their story and know to separate that emotionally. Another thing to talk about too with this is chronic pain. So chronic pain is so complex and everyone's story is very individualized. So one person can have back pain that they've had for 10 years and another person may have back pain that they've had for 10 years, but their experiences are very, very different. The causes can be very different. What they've gone through for treatments can be very different. Their mindset can be very different. So no one can compare themselves to somebody else. Your pain is very, very subjective. And what you can tolerate is going to be very, very different from somebody else. So we can't compare those. And we also can't own somebody else's experience. So if you hear of somebody who's gone through a chronic pain struggle for decades and maybe went through failed back surgeries and tried multiple medications and then had secondary complications from that, all those stories can add up and really create an atmosphere of fear in you. And so it's so important because, I'll talk about this in future episodes. I've kind of talked about this in past, but when we have fear that builds up, what happens is that our nervous system takes that on as a threat. And that then perpetuates the cycle of pain, perpetuates the cycle of anxiety, stress, hormonal release, neurotransmitter release. And it becomes this vicious cycle that continues on and on. So we really have to be able to use our best judgment in knowing what is our story versus what is someone else's story. So the biggest thing is do not own someone else's story. Make sure that you know what your story is and that no matter how similar someone is to you and what they've gone through, your story will be very different. So make sure you just take a look into yourself and what you've gone through and not expect all the ill effects that maybe somebody else has gone through because they may have a similar backstory to you. So one thing that's really important is that when you're listening to someone who is telling you their story, whether it's about their eating disorder, chronic pain, or whatever it may be, a stressful situation, to really internalize the dialogue in your head that that is not my story. And you may even say that out loud. That is not my story, because that vocalization, the internalization of saying those words to yourself will help trigger your prefrontal cortex to differentiate between what is yours and what is theirs. Without that, that's when things start to get blended. So if you're listening to somebody, or maybe you're in like a Facebook group where there's a lot of people who are going through a similar thing as you, make sure, as much as that can be beneficial to commiserate with other people, it also can be very, very detrimental if you start owning all those stories as your own. So using the vocalization and the internalization of saying literally, that is not my story, and teaching your brain to differentiate between those is so crucial for healing. So that's one part I want to talk to you about, is using that as far as owning things and not owning things. So own your story, don't own anyone else's story. Another thing is, what stories are you keeping? So aside from what you're hearing with other people, what are you telling yourself on a daily basis? And I think about a patient of mine who I've worked with, and I've gone into her apartment, and she has these 2 shelves, and on the shelves are all these little knickknacks and little dishes and like dolls and carvings. And every time I go there, she'll tell me a story about one of those things. So for instance, there's this giraffe that's like a wood carved giraffe. And she said that her father had taken this trip to Africa and brought this giraffe back to her. And she always admired it because of the craftsmanship behind it. And just that it was, from her father. And it just brought back really happy memories of those times. So she kept it on a shelf, and she's been up there for years, and she just enjoys looking at it. And then there was a set of dishes that had been in her family and meant a lot to her because of the heritage and just, again, the craftsmanship that had been there, and really the backstory of how it ended up coming from Poland and then made its way here into America. So each day, she would tell me all these little stories. Each little thing that was on her shelf has a story. And each story that she would tell me would be some kind of joyful representation of what each, knickknack was on that shelf. And it made me think that what's on our shelf is so crucial for how we view life. And while it's probably more typical that we keep our decorations more positive and joyful, the things that we keep on our internal shelf may not be the same. And we need to really start cleaning out our shelves if we want to move forward in healing. And so that is really crucial, because again, if we are bombarded by negativity or something that maybe didn't go well, and we keep playing this story in our head, it will only perpetuate that pain cycle. It will only perpetuate the anxiety, the stress that we experience. So we really have to be careful about what we keep on our shelf. And even, you can start with your environment, look around your room, look around your space, and just sense the energy that you get from something. Is there something that you're keeping? And I'm literally just talking about physical objects at this point. Is there something that you're keeping that has maybe a not so pleasant memory, but you feel like you just have to keep it? I can think, back on my own self, in that I used to keep letters that I had written back in the day that weren't very positive. And I would look back on it, and it just wouldn't be a great feeling when I would read them. It just didn't feel good. It was very negative towards myself. And it just, I don't know why I wrote those back then, but I know I was in a very different place, and I just kept them for years because I just didn't throw them out. But, reading them, it just made me feel like, wow, it made me sad that, I had that thought process towards myself. And moving forward, I had to really think, is that serving me? So me keeping those letters on my shelf, is that serving me? Is it moving me forward? Does it make me feel good and joyful? As simple as that is. And the answer is no. And so you have to really get rid of those things that are not serving you and moving you in a direction that you want to go. And when I talk about serving you, what that means is that, what is your end goal? Is your end goal being pain-free? Is your end goal moving freely? Is it living life without having the tethers of feeling guilty for everything you put in your mouth? Or is it just having the calmness or relaxation or tools just to feel like you're human again? Whatever it is that you're dreaming of, think of every part in your life, and is it moving you in the direction towards that? Or is it moving in a direction away from that? And for me, those letters that I had written back in the day were not moving me in the direction that I want to go and did not serve my future. It only kept me in my past. So in that instance, that would be something I would remove from my shelf. And so I want you to think about yourself. What are some things that you're keeping on your shelf that maybe is not serving you anymore? Are you reminded of maybe a past event that didn't go well and that you came down on yourself harshly for? That, again, remove it from your shelf. Stop telling yourself that story. And it may seem so simple, just don't tell yourself that story, remove it. But what you can do is replace that story with something positive. So if it's a negative story, maybe I'll make it a simple example. Maybe you didn't make the basketball team and that was your goal. And that happened to affect you and feel like a really negative thing in your life. What you can do is replace that story with something that did work out. We're always going to have polar opposites, things that did not go in our favor and things that did go in our favor. So every time you're reminded of yourself, oh, I wasn't good enough, they didn't want me at that point. Think of an instant when you felt like you were wanted, that you did feel like you were enough, and replace those negative stories. So every time they come up, not to say that we can stop those because they will come up again, but have a story ready that serves you to replace it the minute that does come up. So that's another really important tool to do that will move you in a better direction towards healing. And now I just want to talk about how can we make healing and moving forward fun and experimental. And I say fun in a relative term because fun has a lot of different meanings for a lot of people. Probably when we think of our time as a kid, fun would be like toys, hanging out with friends, new adventures, maybe traveling somewhere. But fun can have a daily meaning too. So our brains are actually wired in a way that fun means experimentation and exploration. It means trial and error. It's almost like if you were running an experiment, you're trying out a variable and seeing if it works. And our brains thrive on that. Our brains thrive on new experiences that they can learn from and figure out, was that positive? Did it bring me pleasure? Or did that bring me pain? And our brains love that because they're wired for learning. And learning is basically what we do every day. Whether you realize it or not, every single experience that you go through, whether it's positive or negative, is wiring you for learning and wiring you for moving forward. And if we can make healing like that, where you experiment, try something, and learn from it, then now we can move forward. And from my experience in working with many people who have had chronic pain and then the combination of chronic pain and eating disorders, is that people tend to get into a stagnant pattern of behavior. And what that means is that they kind of just go along with what has been told to them. So, here, take this medication. Here, do this procedure. Here, try this surgery. And a lot of the means in which they try are external to them. So their brain loses that excitement of, let me just try this. Let me see if this works. Let me see if this changes anything, because everything is an external input and it's external to us. So we lose some of that sense of self and being able to help ourselves. And we kind of start learning this learned helplessness where we no longer feel empowered to help ourselves, and that we rely on external stimulus and inputs to help us heal. And so what we have to do is transition from relying on everything external to us to help us, that maybe my situation will change. Maybe I'll get a new job. Maybe, that person will stop, making me feel this way. We need to stop looking at that, because again, a lot of that is out of our control, and it teaches our brains to feel less empowered. So what we have to do is make that fun in a way. And again, I say that in a relative term because it may seem silly to say, how do we make this fun? But again, what I mean by fun is try something, see if it works, see how you feel, and then move forward and learn from it. And this doesn't have to be anything big. It literally can be just something different. But if you're constantly trying just something different and learning from it, it will actually wire your brain to step forward. And again, I'll give you some examples. So 2 minutes a day, that's all it takes. Just try something for 2 minutes a day. And again, it's not this overwhelming thing that you have to do and do this whole life overhaul for anything to happen. If you can just devote 2 minutes to trying something new and see how it feels afterwards, that will be the catalyst to help your brain rewire and help your brain learn how it can become a better version that is serving you. So try this tomorrow, or even today, at the end of the day. Try doing just 2 minutes of breath work, whether you've done it before or you've never done it. Literally set a timer, so you don't have to do any more than 2 minutes. Set a timer, close your eyes, sit in a relaxed position, and inhale for a count of 6. So you're literally just going to close your eyes and inhale for a count of 6, and then you're going to exhale for a count of 6. And then just repeat this literally for 2 minutes. Just try that. And then see how you feel afterwards. And again, some of you may respond wonderfully and feel very relaxed. Some of you may feel no different afterwards, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that this has to be this miraculous change. But the big thing that you'll gain from that is that you're trying things and your brain starts seeing, okay, what did I learn from that? And again, it may not be this big thing that you learn, or you can maybe feel like a little bit more relaxed, or you feel just a little bit less tense. And again, that's that stepping stone for your brain to learn a new processing and not be stagnant. Because the worst thing we can do for healing is feel stagnant. That squashes hope. It makes us feel like there's no change. This is where we're going to be. And that perpetuates that negative self-talk, negative feelings. And then again, here's our story that starts to develop in ourselves, that this is how I'm always going to be. I'll never feel the way I want to feel. I'll never get back to the way I felt, maybe years ago before I went through all this. So we have to give ourselves some kind of change. Rewrite your story, even if it's just 2 minutes a day. Start rewriting your story today, because after multiple sessions of just experimenting, and literally I'm talking about 2 minutes a day, you'll notice a change happening. And again, I'm not promising miraculous results of do this for a month and your whole life will be changed. But I can guarantee that if you change something each day, and even if it's just 2 minutes, your brain will be different a month from now, a week from now, a day from now than it is in this moment. So doing those small steps actually can have tremendous results. So I know it was a lot in this episode, but again, just to revisit some of the things I talked about, own your own story, do not own other stories. And especially many women, in particular, and men, again, who go through eating disorders and chronic pain, we tend to be very sensitive people. We tend to take on a lot. We tend to be perfectionists and put a lot of stress on ourselves. So we end up absorbing a lot of the negative things that we hear. So we have to set ourselves up to differentiate between what is ours and what is someone else's. So again, what I was saying for the tool, just say to yourself, and it may seem silly at first, but try saying out loud, that is not my story. And it really will make a change. And again, if you feel like you can't say it out loud, say in your head, that is not my story. You do not have to own every story that you hear that did not go well. So that's the one thing I talked about. Own and keep the stories that serve you. That was the second thing I talked about. So again, what is on your shelf? So again, I literally and figuratively, what do you surround yourself with? But again, also, what are you internalizing? What are you saying in your head on a daily basis? And what you can do to set yourself up for success is have those backup stories that were positive in your life to replace some of those negative stories that you tell yourself. Because again, realistically, we're not going to abolish every negative thought. That's not realistic. That will not happen. Our brains aren't simply wired to do that. But what we can do is have a backup to replace some of those negative stories. And again, stepstone ourselves into a better direction. And then again, the third thing I talked about today was making healing fun. Change just one thing a day for 2 minutes, and you will start seeing your brain actually rewiring. You will start seeing a change in your thought process. And again, 2 minutes a day, that's all it takes for just to start that process of changing. And you'll notice that once you start that and make it attainable, 2 minutes is not that long of a time, you'll actually start seeing that like steamrolling pattern of, a positive snowball effect that, okay, I did 2 minutes today. This is kind of easy. And then maybe you do 4 minutes, maybe you do 6 minutes, and then you start really getting yourself momentum, because healing and success and anything you want to do in life is about momentum. We can't just use our grit and our determination and our stubbornness or willpower to move us to where we want to be. It just doesn't work like that. We only have so many resources for that. So you have to use momentum and do things that you want to do rather than feeling like I should do this, because there's too much of I should in life. There needs to be more of I want to do this for myself. So start that momentum with just 2 minutes a day. Okay. So those are my 3 take homes for today. Again, please subscribe to this podcast if you found any benefit from this. I'm on Apple, Spotify, Anchor, and also please leave a review if you found this to be useful, or if you have any questions or comments. I would love to hear from you. Again, thank you again for joining me on this episode of Rewiring Health, and I look forward to future episodes that I have. I have quite a few in the works right now, and really just serving you with the best information I can with nervous system regulation and lifestyle changes for women who have gone through eating disorders and chronic pain. So please join me in future episodes. And again, subscribe to the channel and so you can get the latest updates on all that. Enjoy your day. And thank you again for joining me on Rewiring Health.